Welcome to another episode of the Attic Fables podcast, where together we learn how to face the ups and downs of life with faith and confidence. In today's episode, I want to consider whether it's a good idea to use the genealogies in the Bible to prove the age of the earth. Young Earth creationists believe that they can estimate the age of the earth by using the genealogies in the Bible to count backwards to Adam and Eve. Terry Mortensen, a leading young Earth creationist, says that the genealogies of Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 11 give us the years from Adam to Abraham. And this sets the date of creation at approximately 6,000 years ago. Unfortunately, for young Earth creationists, there are two glaring problems with these genealogies. The first problem is that the genealogical lists in Genesis 5 and 11 are too short to account for the time humans have been on Earth. We've been on Earth, humans have been on Earth for over 100,000 years, and these lists do not account for that long time span. The second problem is that the extraordinarily long lifespans of men, like Methuselah, for example, are not biologically possible. Humans just are not able to live 500, 600, 700, 800, 900 years, as the Bible seems to indicate. From the outset, it's important to note that the Bible does not tell us the age of the earth, and attempts to prove the age of the earth from its genealogies are wrong-headed, because the genealogies do not function as time markers. They're not chronological. That's not the purpose. That's not the function of these genealogical lists. The purpose of the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5, Genesis chapter 11, and other genealogies is primarily to show lineage and ancestry. What do I mean? Bible scholars and historians have shown that the Hebrews and other societies in the ancient Near East took great care to preserve their family history by compiling genealogical lists. The purpose of this preservation was to maintain their status in the community. The legitimacy, authority, and prestige of kings and priests, administrators, military and clan leaders was bolstered by records that proved their lineage and ancestry. In addition to helping legitimize social status, genealogies could be used to prove and protect legal rights, especially property rights and property ownership. The genealogies are records of the pedigree and ancestry of important people. Think about Jesus' pedigree. Jesus is repeatedly called the son of David, king of Israel. Matthew's gospel traces Jesus' pedigree back to King David to show the legitimacy of the claim that Jesus is king. Some Bible scholars take a different approach when it comes to the genealogies. In an attempt to explain the archaeological evidence for the presence of Homo sapiens on Earth for at least 100,000 years, they propose gaps in the genealogies. They say that the Hebrew word yalad, meaning to give birth or to beget, may refer to the begetting of grandchildren or great-grandchildren, allowing for gaps and missing names in the genealogical records. The problem with this approach is that to account for the missing years, the gaps between names would be so great that they would render the genealogies meaningless. We're not talking about a few missing names or a few missing generations. To account for the 100,000 years of human history, the genealogies would have to have enormous gaps. And because the purpose of the genealogies is to show direct lineage and ancestry, such huge gaps or missing names would weaken such claims. Christians who use the genealogies in the Bible to calculate time are using them incorrectly because the genealogies are not chronological records. They are records of lineage and ancestry that legitimize, protect, and advance the status of rulers and heads of clans. The main argument against using these lists to prove the age of the earth is that they were not designed to calculate chronology. Now you might protest this, saying, hey, Pastor Steve, wait a minute. These lists do show chronology because they record the person's age at the time of their death. This sure sounds like chronology to me. Here too, young earth creationists make a mistake. Human biology prevents us, or anyone, any human who ever lived, our biology prevents us from living much more than 100 years. Our cells have about a 100-year limit for how long they can reproduce. After about 100 years, our cells stop dividing and die or enter a non-functional state. We certainly cannot live for 700 or 800 years because our cells have a limit for how long they can reproduce and repair themselves. Lifespans of hundreds of years are simply not biologically possible. And faced with the inability of humans to live far beyond 100 years, some Christians propose a novel theory, a theory that God created Adam and Eve with perfectly or nearly perfect genomes. These nearly perfect bodies allowed them to live for hundreds and hundreds of years. Adam's sin, however, brought a curse. Because of Adam's sin, God cursed the earth, bringing genetic entropy to all life on earth. Because of sin and the curse, humans experience harmful mutations and genetic deterioration, which decreases their lifespan. The antediluvians, those are the people who lived before the flood, kind of a fancy word, antediluvian, but the antediluvians who lived before the flood are said to have lived longer because they lived closer to the time of Adam and Eve. They lived closer to Adam's original, more perfect genetic state. There is, however, no evidence that humans once had nearly perfect genetics. And if this theory were true, genetic entropy would have already wiped out the human race. The truth is, genetic entropy is not happening. We are not on a path to biological extinction. People are actually living longer lives today than in previous generations. As a theory, genetic entropy cannot explain why the antediluvians lived such long lives. So how do we explain the long ages, the long lives of those who lived before Noah's flood? 700, 800, 900 years. How do we explain what these ages mean? The explanation is that the extraordinarily long lives of the antediluvians are not actual history. The long ages are stated for theological and literary purposes. The writers of these genealogies attribute such long lives to the antediluvians to highlight their social status and importance. This is not actual history, but is a story with a literary and theological purpose. Their long lives show that they had God's blessings. Such description of extraordinarily long lives function as a type of memorial that elevates the person's status and shows they enjoyed God's favor. Bible scholars call this literary technique heroic idealization. Heroic idealization is the literary technique of elevating the status of an individual by exaggerating their virtues, their bravery, their achievements, and their wealth. Although such exaggerations may reflect historical circumstances, they might reflect some reality. Such descriptions are usually hyperbolic and should not be considered literally or historically factual. Job, for example, let's think about Job. Job is described as blameless and upright. No problem there. One who feared God and turned away from evil. No problem with that. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. 7 and 3. How convenient that Job's offspring, his sons, 7 sons, very significant number in the Bible, and 3 daughters, another very significant number in the Bible. 7 and 3, 7 sons, 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep. Again, the number 7,000 sheep, a vast amount of sheep if you ask me. 3,000 camels, there's the 3 again. 5,000 yoke of oxen, which mean he had 1,000 oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. So that this man, meaning Job was the greatest of all the people in the East. And so these numbers reflect a way for the author to elevate the status of Job. God allowed Satan to take everything that Job had and afflict Job with disease. And at the end of the story, we're told that the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. He had 14,000 sheep, twice as many as he started out with. And again, these 2 times 7,000. 6,000 camels, 2 times 3,000. 1,000 yoke of oxen. In other words, he had 2,000 oxen. 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Again, at the beginning, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters, but they were killed. And then he has more sons and daughters at the end of the story. And he has 7 sons again, and again 3 daughters. And it says there were no women so beautiful. No, his daughters were the most beautiful anywhere. And after this, Job lived another 140 years. We don't know how old he was at the time of the beginning of the story. But after everything that happened that we read about, he lived an additional 140 years. Now, believing that this description of Job is a literal description stretches credulity. In the same way, the extraordinarily long lives of the antediluvians should not be considered historically factual. The writer is giving these long lifespans to serve a theological and literary purpose, not a historical record. When challenged to think deeply about these issues, some well-meaning Christians will ask, what difference does it make to their salvation? What difference do these genealogies and how to explain it all and the age of the earth, what difference does it make to their walk with Jesus? Well, it may not make any difference to them. But what about the millions of inquisitive young people who are seeking answers to these questions? Often, unfortunately, they are told, you can either believe God or you can believe science. You can't believe both. One or the other. Choose God or choose science. Who are you going to follow? That's the choice. But this is a false choice, and those who say such things will someday have to answer to God for the consequences, because unfortunately, when faced with scientific evidence, many young people are turning their backs on the church. When a young person goes to college and studies geology or astronomy, they're presented with overwhelming evidence for an old Earth, an Earth that is millions and millions and millions of years old, hundreds of millions, billions of years old. If they study archaeology, they learn that humans have been on the planet for at least 100,000 years, much, much, much more than the 6,000 years proposed by the young Earth creationists. We've been on this planet for at least 100,000 years. And if people study biology or geriatrics, they are given biological and genetic evidence that our bodies and any human who ever lived cannot live for hundreds of years. When Christian young people seek answers about these issues, we should not tell them to choose between science and the Bible. This is a false choice that leaves them with a dilemma and turns them away from the church. We have to remember all truth is God's truth, whether or not it's in the special revelation of His Word, the Bible, or if it's in general revelation of the universe, of the created universe. It's all God's truth. So while the answers to these questions may not affect your spiritual life, it does affect the spiritual life of young people who are seeking the truth. Our task as Bible-believing Christians is to accept the fact that the Bible is not a history book or a book about science. The Bible is a book about God. We must stop forcing the Bible to be something it is not. And when we stop trying to force the Bible to answer questions about human biology or the age of the earth, we will begin to read the Bible in the way the authors intended, a book about God. We have a book that tells us about a great God who loves us and sent Jesus to deliver us from our sins. We have a book that can free people from sin and give them life. Let's not turn it into something that rational, intelligent people cannot believe. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode of the Attic Fables podcast. Until next time, remember, no matter who you are, no matter where you're from, no matter what you've done, God loves you.